One thing I'd like to know is, what's your earliest recollections of poetry? Or in other words, what do you think first introduced you to poetry? Can you remember?
Oh dear me. Well, I was not a young man, and I was stood in the back bedroom of a house in Old Firth that we used to live in, and I was thinking about building an extension, and my dear lady at the time wasn't keen. And I got in a bit of a dark mood about that, and I think that was my first poem.
Okay, so what you're saying is that your first introduction, if you like, to poetry was through writing it?
Yes, I think so. I think I wrote stuff before I bothered to go and read stuff.
Okay, that's quite interesting. Most people have been brought up with some kind of poetry in their lives, whether it was just poems at primary school that their teacher read them, or rhymes that their mum might have read them. Can you not remember any of that?
No, I can't. I don't remember a lot of poetry. But I listened to a lot of music, and I think the lyrics in music were probably, especially some of the sadder music I might have been listening to, some Tom Waits perhaps, or that other chap who introduces suicide to the youngsters. Can't remember his name. I might have been reading some of them sort of lyrics, and that might have been what got me writing. But I don't remember. Well, I didn't go to English class very often at school. Certainly not at grammar school. I wouldn't have done any poetry. I might have done some at junior school. But I had a pretty bad accident on my bike when I was about 10, and I lost a lot of my memories from that early childhood. And maybe some of the poetry might have gone then, I don't know.
Okay. So what you're saying is that the first poem that you wrote was really inspired through an emotion that you were feeling at the time?
Yes, I was. I was not happy about a few things, and I think I was getting frustrated at not being able to move things on. I think I was ambitious as a youngster, and this was our third house, each one a bit bigger than the last one, and I wanted to make this one bigger still. And I think my dear lady had probably run a course on getting bigger houses.
Can you remember the poem? Have you still got it?
No, I don't think I have. I've looked high and low for it.
Okay.
Times many I've looked for it.
But you wrote it down?
Yes, I wrote it down. I can remember writing it down. I can remember thinking I had to write it down. And I don't know why I should have got rid of it. I don't remember any positive decision to get rid of it. I am quite good at losing stuff.
So was it a bit of a cathartic thing to do?
Oh, yeah, well, cathartic's a fair word to choose.
Did it stop you from hitting your dear lady at the time?
No, but it probably hastened the end of that particular route. Cracks.
Right. So, how did you progress then? That was your first poem, and you were, what age were you then? In your 20s? I don't know.
Oh, no, I'm talking now, that was 1986, 1987, so I should be 34, 35, mid-30s anyway, something of that sort of age.
Right, okay. And so you wrote this poem?
Yeah.
And then how long was it before you wrote another one?
Well, the next thing I can really remember, and I don't know how it came about, but I can remember buying or remember getting hold of a copy of a book of poetry. It was the Eric Gregory Awards. It might have been for 1986, 1987, something like that. I can remember getting hold of this book of poetry, and I was going to a summer school there in Sussex, Open University Summer School. I don't know what I was doing actually. I think I might have been doing psychology, even though most of the degree was mathematics and technology. But I got this book and I thought that would be a good way for me as a technical man to show these cultured people that I got a bit of culture. So I made sure everybody saw I got it. And I met a few people who were interested in poetry during that week. In fact, I was smoking at the time, and one lady gave me a poem out of The Guardian, I think it was, which I think I've still got in that book, in that Gregory book, basically about the ills of smoking, and that I shouldn't see too late in my life if I carried on.
And at this time, were you writing poetry or just reading it then?
I think I was reading a bit then and not doing so much writing then. I don't think I started writing a couple of years after that. I think I started writing in, any more than other than occasional jottings.
And when you started writing again, or writing, did you find that the impetus to write came from different sources, or was it still tending to be from, or maybe it still is, I don't know, do you write out of emotion, I suppose is what I'm asking, or is it other things that prompt you to write? Does it vary?
Well, I think then it was very much emotional. I think now it very much now is about catching how I'm feeling at a particular time. That's what mostly I'm doing in my poetry. It's how I feel at a particular time. Back then it might have been work or relationships, or there was a period I moved down into Devon and I had a lot of time on my own, so I had time to write. And I remember I was listening to a lot of music. I got myself a really nice flat and I didn't have a television. So I was listening to music, I was doing pastel crayoning, and I was probably doing a bit of writing. I don't think I had a computer then. And that probably means I don't have any copies of that writing. I might have some.
And
but yes, it was emotion. It was emotion that got me started, and I think my poems. I don't think you'd find any poem other than I was seriously playing about with some daft idea. I think they'd all have a bit of emotion in somewhere. They'd certainly all have a bit of either personal angst or personal joy.
So does that mean that at that time you would have perhaps written in a more ad hoc way than perhaps you do now?
Oh, certainly.
Knowing you now, I know that you write quite regularly.
Yeah.
Then was it, that you might write a poem today and then maybe not write another one for a week?
Absolutely. I was also a bit fanciful then on what sort of paper I wrote on. So if I didn't have the right sort of paper about, then I wouldn't bother with writing. So that often meant if I went to I was working away quite a lot, or staying away quite a lot, so if I went to a gallery it had a fancy bit of paper, or a bookshop with a fancy bit of paper, then I'd buy that, and that would encourage me to write something. So I think some of my early stuff in boxes, wherever, will be written on bits of paper with serrated edges and bits of moths stuck in it and all that sort of stuff.
I think that might have lingered with you somewhat, hasn't it? And I've noticed that you always like to write nice books with just the right pencil. Does that make a difference to?
Well, I think I've formalised very much now. You are right. I now very much usually write in an A5 book, plain paper, not ruled paper. Plain paper in an A5 book, and I think that's come about with perhaps that Don Patterson chap summed it up when I went to one of his workshops when he was talking about the shape of a quatrain, the shape of a sonnet, and thinking about that rectangle and thinking about making your words just long enough for the page and thinking about deciding to actually turn over the page. And I'd been doing that with these A5 books for 2 or 3 years before that, but just by chance, not because I'd heard or read anything about it. But I think there is something in that if you've got a pencil that writes in a particular size and a page that's a particular size, then you'll get a bit of shape to your poem. And I think my poems, I'm as interested quite often in and I think this comes from the mathematics, I'm as interested in the visual layout and the symmetry and the space to the margins and all that sort of stuff. I guess anything not to be interested in English, really.
Although I've noticed that you're not particularly fond of poetry that's written by other poets that might be, cascading across the page and making pretty patterns. Is that true? Is that fair to say?
Well, I should say it's spot on, and I don't think it's very rare I do that, and I try not to do that. I think there's a particular skill there, and it's one that I don't have either as a writer or a reader. I certainly...
So you can't do it and you don't enjoy it in other people's poetry?
Actually, so that's probably true of more than just that as well. I can't do well-structured poetry, and that might not be the poetry then that I like. In others, I mean.
Right, okay. Although I think almost what you're saying is that you use external agencies, if you like, to put the form on your poetry, like the A5 book and the correct size pencil and the straight margins and spaces on either side. Is that right?
Yeah, I am using
That's
that.
guiding you
I am using
somewhere.
that, and in a way you could say that is working in a structure, and I wouldn't be able to argue against that. Not that I'd want to argue against it. What I'm perhaps not so good at is what I would call the English-based, language-based, and rhyme-based, and fancy. Not fancy. Fancy is the wrong word, but formal structures. If it fits and it works for me, I think it's difficult then for me to shape it into something that fits somebody else's rules, if you like.
Right. So, have you got poets that you particularly admire? And if so, what exactly is it about their writing that you admire? What makes a good poet?
Well, I particularly don't like the word good poet or good poetry.
For you, personally?
Well, I've heard that word and seen that word used by a lot of what I would call establishment people. I'm not fond at all of the term good poetry. It's for me, the person that writes it, if they enjoy writing it, then it's been bloody good poetry. And what somebody else makes of it is slightly less important. But your original question about who I like, I surprised myself really there. I don't think there's any poet that I've ever read that I didn't like some of the poetry. You know, whether that's John Masefield with his Cargoes poem, or Yevtushenko with Zima Junction. My favourite poet is probably Narada, and I guess that's partly because I think, well, obviously all men would like to be the lover that he was, I suppose, but he does write poetry with love and emotion that seems to just flow so easily. And he also seems to have a style that don't necessarily bother about style, which is, to me, is really refreshing. I can pick up more or less any of his poem and just enjoy reading it. Even reading it in Spanish and not having a clue what it's on about, I can still enjoy it. I like Simon Armitage. You know, I lived for a long part of my life about 7 or 8 miles away from where Simon Armitage was brought up and where he learned his poetry. So I don't suppose it's a surprise really that, you know, I like some of his stuff. I think I've got a book somewhere called Kid that would have been one of the early books of poetry that I bought, and laughed out loud at some of his stuff, and nearly cried at some of his other stuff. So, you know, I think he's a lot cleverer than some people would like to think he is.
So when you're writing poetry, are you writing it for yourself?
Well, the last year I've been studying, so I have been writing it for somebody else then. But no, you know, I am almost always. I went to a workshop with David Allen, I think he is, children's writer, and he said, you know, writing should be fun. And that's what poetry is for me. My writing and my poetry is always a pleasure. I always enjoy that writing process. You know, it's better than cigarettes and beer and one or two other things. So yeah, first and foremost, I'm writing for myself. And I guess I am a bit of an hedonist. So again, that's no surprise really. But I do really like it. I wrote some poetry for our neighbours, which caused a lot of fun in their household, and I really enjoyed that. So it would be nice to write for other people and to see them enjoying that stuff that I'd written.
So you would like to be published?
That's a good question. I would like people to enjoy my poetry, and I'm not sure necessarily that sticking it on a bookshelf in Waterstones is the answer to that. I think it's perhaps one of the ways, but I'm not so sure it's the only way. And I'm very conscious that I've seen a lot of stuff and read a lot of stuff myself that I never quite got hold of until somebody helped me with it. So I think the publishing thing is, and really that's what started this about as well, because I was conscious that I wanted people to know something about the poet, to get some idea about what the poetry was about. Because I think without that you might be struggling a bit.
So in that sense, do you think that performance poetry might be one of the answers? It's not uncommon these days for poets to have shows, if you like, is it?
No, it's not.
People
No,
pay to go and
no.
listen to the poet reading their poetry.
I've seen some really good performance poetry. I've seen some bloody poor stuff as well. I quite enjoy reading myself, but it is a frightening thing at the time. So I've great admiration for people, especially people who can read without the notes with them. I don't know whether I'm any good or not as a performance poet. People who have heard me said, yeah, that's not so bad. But I don't know how I'd be to a wider audience who might not even be able to understand me.
Mm. Do you think it matters whether people understand your poetry or not, or whether they get it?
Well,
and do you care whether they understand it?
I read T.S. Eliot, The Wastelands. Well, I read another one of his before that actually, and I hadn't a clue what they were about, but I thought it was bloody good stuff, and I couldn't stop myself reading it, and I enjoyed the process of reading it. So I'm not so sure that you need to know what stuff's about. Later on I went back to The Wastelands and I read it in what they call some fancy thing on the internet where it explains it all as it's going through, and that were a dead loss. So I think you want to feel the poem, and I want people to be able to feel my poems. Whether they understand it or not, I'm not so sure it matters. I wouldn't want to deliberately mislead people. But I think I sometimes go off at tangent and into personal space. And if somebody can latch on to that, well, fair enough, you know. I just hope they can feel it. But it's not deeply intellectual, so there's no point in getting out an encyclopedia, really.
Okay. What would you like people to say about your poetry?
Well, that they'd enjoyed it, that it had been a bit of fun, and that they'd enjoyed it, that the process of reading it had been, somehow it had made their eyes smile for a minute or two. I certainly, I'm not interested in them, talking about it at an intellectual level. I don't think it's that at all. I think it's just trying to lift people's spirits for a few minutes, because that's what it does to me when I'm writing it. Lifts my spirits.
Do you think there's a tendency to treat poetry too seriously?
Oh Christ, yes. I think it's a disaster what's happened to poetry in many respects. I think it's become far too precious a thing. And I think there's a place, don't get me wrong, I think there's a place for You know, in life there's layers of everything, levels of everything, there's hierarchies of stuff. And there's a place for, there's a place for poetry that's nothing like my poetry. But there absolutely should not be any exclusivity, and there shouldn't be any barriers to anyone. And I think that's why I so much dislike the term good poetry, because I think the people that think good poetry and talk about good poetry are them people that's on the top shelf. And I'm not so sure that is actually where it all sits. I think there's a bit of confusion as to about what tingles people's spines and what doesn't tingle the spine.
So if you were to compare poetry to music, for instance, can you use music using music as a comparison? Where do you think your poetry, where would you like it to sit? Would you like it to sit amongst the Last Night of the Proms, or jazz music, or rap, or Top of the Pops? How popular would you like to be, in other words, or how highbrow, or how accessible?
Well, I think that is a really...
Is that a daft question?
No, I think it's probably the most interesting question thus far, because when you asked me about what poetry I liked, and I said I'd not really picked up any poet that I didn't like some of the stuff. Much can be said the same for music. There's hardly any music that I've touched upon that I didn't like a bit of it. And that can be like avant-garde electronic stuff, and jazz, and reggae, and pop music, and rock music, and heavy metal music, and punk, and rap, and soul, and blues. I think, but I think that the thing that it strikes me that music is much more accessible to everybody and much more level-headed to everybody. In fact, it went through my mind that when the music business decided to start making pop music videos, that was the day that poetry really missed a trick. Because I think music seems always to have embraced the latest technology and the latest way of exploiting itself and letting itself be heard. And I think that's what poetry should be doing. Poetry should be using all them channels and all them ways to make itself just as accessible as music. And I think that then knocks down, the music schools and, the Huddersfield choral society competitions. They are up there, but they're not in charge of everything. It's a much more level carry on. And I think that's where poetry has got itself lost in literature. It's not widely enough spread at all. But I think I've been there before anyway. So I'm ranting a bit now.
Okay.
It's perhaps time I give up, actually.
I think that'll do.
Will it?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.